My name is Richard Hilleman. For the last 30 many years, I've worked in the video game business. Some of you know me best from Electronic Arts. Worked on lots of different kinds of games there, ranging from Chuck Yeager's Flight Trainer to the fabulous Todd Rundgren No World Order title that all of you bought and played religiously. Oh, wait a minute, none of you bought and played religiously. I grew up in a couple of places, Minneapolis and Las Vegas. If you knew me when I was in my teens, you'd be sure I would be devoted to being in the music business for a bunch of different reasons. I worked in a music store, sold synthesizers. I bought records incessantly. I played in bands. I engineered other people's records. I did lots of things. What also made me particularly weird at that time was I also made guitars. So this is one of those guitars. That's an Alembic, 1976 Series 2 Alembic that was actually built for a guy named Greg Lake of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. In 1976, I desperately wanted that guitar. That guitar in 1976 cost $8,000. For context, a Corvette in 1976 cost $8,000. So that guitar had active pickups, it had low-pass filters instead of traditional tone controls, it had preamps. It was essentially a state-of-the-art instrument for that time. And because I couldn't buy one of those, I decided to make one. The byproduct of making one of those instruments was I learned how to solder. So in 1983, when I applied for a job at Electronic Arts, there were two candidates for the job that I was up for, a guy named Evan Robinson, who you may actually see here over the course of the weekend, and he told me this story. I had never heard it before, but according to him, I got the job because I could solder. So in a very real sense, that guitar right there is responsible for me being here. If you don't like me, blame that guitar. One of the things that was happening at the same time that I was building this guitar was there was a revolution going on in the music business, and that was the emergence of punk rock. Now, a lot of you associate that with the sound and the instrumentation and the songwriting, and that is important. But that actually wasn't what was important to me at the time and didn't turn out to be the really important thing. Punk rock was as much a revolution about the business of music as it was about the music of music. The reason why is because it took all of the infrastructure that had been built for the AAA, top-of-the-line bands of its time and deconstructed it down to something that was accessible to any band. This was a magazine that I read at the time called Circus. Anybody here ever read this magazine? Ah, there you go. So what was their favorite band, by the way? It wasn't Paul Rogers. You don't remember? Oh, they loved Kiss. They put Kiss on the cover and they would sell a million things. So they were very entrenched in the traditional AAA, highly promoted dinosaur rock business of that time. But buried in this magazine was an article, and it was an article about a new record from a band called the Ramones. And what was interesting about it was the person talked about how the record had gotten made, where it had gotten made, and how remarkable it was that they had made it for $5,000. Why that's remarkable is Elton John that year had spent $1 million at Caribou Studio and had failed to actually produce the record. So in this era, $5,000 was like a miracle. And here was a band that literally made what they thought was a nearly perfect record for $5,000. The Ramones had been around for a while, been around since the very early 70s, and they had desperately wanted to be other bands. As a band they liked in particular, Johnny liked other bands like Led Zeppelin and The Who. The problem with the Ramones is they weren't good enough to play that stuff. And so in general, they played what they could play. But that wasn't the only band they liked. They played what they could play because that's what they could play. It turned out that Joey liked another band. So the other thing that's going on in the 70s is that we're drenched in this 50s nostalgia. And that was personified mostly by American Graffiti, which in addition to creating Star Wars, I would argue also helped create punk rock. We'll come back to that in a second. But spinning out of the success of American Graffiti was a whole bunch of other things. The Lords of Flatbush was a movie that came out the next year featuring Henry Winkler and Sylvester Stallone. Happy Days came out the year after and ran forever. And we'll forgive him for Joni and Chachi, I think. And then Grease followed right on its tail. And we kind of spun through the end of the 70s, essentially in the 50s and early 60s. And then there was this other band, Shana Na was a band that was playing 60s and 50s songs, and they had been around since the 60s. They never went away. Shana Na played at Woodstock. That's how long they'd been around. But this was Joey's favorite band. And if you listen to the Ramones, what they're playing is 60s doo-wop played at about 125% of normal speed. So what they didn't really invent new music, they just invented a new way to play it faster so they didn't get booed off stage. That was pretty much the driver for them. So at the end of the day, they deconstructed the business that they were in. They had a place to play CBGBs. They had a record company called Sire that had record distribution. And they had figured out how to talk to their audience through a collection of assets like fanzines and playing live constantly. Punk rock was an accident that just happened because that's all that those guys could play. But what they did do was they took full advantage of the new tools that were created at the late 70s for new recording acts to break through in new ways. And those same tools are available in the video game business today. What you needed in the music business at the time was you needed a good song, you needed a place to make records, you needed a place to sell records, you probably needed a place to play. In the games business now, you need a great game, you need a place for it to be played and found, and you need a way to get paid. All three of those things are in revolution right now, and many of those tools you're going to learn about over the next couple of days. A lot of the limits that we confront in game development today are production power limitations. That can be the number of people you have, the number of artists that you have, your ability to produce content, your ability to focus on what makes a game great, testing, automated testing in particular, all points of leverage of getting people to make your product better, to add polish to it, to add emphasis to it, and to make sure that it gets found. The other thing that increasingly is an important part is that we are sharing computing power with our customers. And then the final thing is we need to be able to find our players, find our customers, and then engage them. So production power on demand, let's talk about that first. I'm going to go back to the music business for a second. This is AIR Studios in London. It is a cathedral of sound. Who knows who George Martin is? Not that one. The other one, Sir George Martin. So Sir George Martin was the Beatles producer, and this is the studio that he built. This was the most remarkable place in the world. The problem was that these were independent studios that were built outside of the existing framework of the recording industry at the time. They were not owned by the record companies. By contrast, this is Plaza Sound Studios at Radio City Music Hall. A terrific studio, been around since the 40s, continuously updated. People loved the studio, loved to go to it. But the problem was that the recording acts of the late 70s now had money, and so they go to Caribou, they go to AIR, they go to the record plant in New York, these new high-end, designed for the artist institutions, and the record company places like Plaza sat empty. At that particular studio, just to put in context, every single one of these records was made. Dizzy Gillespie, Oscar Peterson, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Lionel Hampton, and Benny Goodman all recorded in that studio. That's a fabulous place. And in 1976, it was sitting empty. In the long term, of course, the real competition became home studios. But the creation of AIR created this second class of studios that were not getting used. And so as a result, the Ramones got to use one of the best studios in the world for almost no money. They worked at night and they paid less than $1,200 for their entire record to be made at that studio. So do you have a big enough lever? The other thing that they needed was they needed production facilities and context to be great. Increasingly, the tools that you have available as even a high school student are exactly the same tools that AAA players have today. There is nothing that a AAA player has as far as technological resources that you as an independent don't have today. You may not have the same time and money that they have, but you have all of the same tools. And if you can figure out how to get high leverage out of those tools, you can play with the big boys, and people have over the last several years. There are also new kinds of games that are possible with the services that are being made today, and those are going to be the entry points for innovation. A lot of you use Alexa in your household probably to figure out when the eggs are done or something like that. There are lots of opportunities for Alexa to be that new channel of interface to your games or to your community. And I'm actually quite interested to see where this goes. Some of the most powerful and interesting experiments are going on in the place where Alexa meets machine learning. And I think that that same capacity and capability is actually available to you if you know how to use it. The next limitation was the power of computing and the games that we make. How many of you have bought more than 25 computers in your life? I believe all of you have. If you add the phones and all the other things that you've had. We have been in the business of supplying the computing power for the games to run as customers for the last 35 years. That's been our job. That's starting to change for a couple of reasons that are no longer allow us to be quite so cavalier about where that computing power is. How many of you have looked at the back of a console anytime recently? Probably not too many of them. But there's this, up on that screen right there is a little line that says 230 watts. So 230 watts is 1 amp at approximately 220 volts AC. There are European regulations about how much power a set-top box can consume. And for the most part, it isn't our fault. It was the cable industry's fault when they, how many of you had a cable box in the mid-'80s that produced more heat than any other thing in your house? Imagine that hooked up to the wiring of a French chateau built in 1600. This is not a prescription for a good day. So what's happened is that the European regulators have taken it into their hands to limit what the total power available is on those devices. So it's been 230 watts for almost a decade, and it's unlikely to go up. The net effect means that if you want your video games to be more powerful in the future, we're going to have to make more efficient use of the machine resources that are on the local box, but we're also going to have to start using computing in other places. And so your ability to reach out to the cloud and ask for computing resources or solutions on demand to your computing problems is going to be the distinction that creates greater value for the products you're making today. And it isn't just the set-top box console business that has to worry about this. The largest video game market in the world is the mobile business today. The mobile video game business, as we know it today, is tethered to a battery that fundamentally limits what their performance will be in the long term. So in spite of the fact that give us a little bit more performance, the battery that it's tied to still is roughly the boat anchor that decides all of the performance of a mobile product today. If we want to add horsepower to those games, if we want to make them richer, deeper, and more engaging, we're going to have to figure out how to use cloud computing resources to expand that experience in fundamental ways. The other thing that comes out of computing power on demand is its ability to meet some of your other needs. We recently shipped a product at Amazon that we built with 58 people that normally, if I were at a place like Electronic Arts, would have more than 400 people making it. A lot of it was the leverage we got from very talented shops out of house like Stella Development and Heavy Iron in this neighborhood, but a lot of it was extremely effective automated testing. Our ability to use automated testing to find our problems meant that in a highly iterative environment of an episodic game, we got consistently better at our bug count with every episode that went forward. Automated testing cannot be underestimated for its value. As these products get bigger, as they get richer, as the variations in online configurations expand, your ability to automate this testing is probably going to be the difference between a high-quality experience for a customer and a low-quality experience. GameLift is an example of some of those assets that have been used by multiple shops. What they've done is they've allowed you to have servers on demand, to have flexible matchmaking capabilities that you don't have to create. They're stateless machines, so you have no downtime for updates that ripple through your server base. They facilitate cross-platform play by making sure that they talk to all formats. And then finally, they'll work with your existing engine and workflows and help you transfer to another one if that's part of the process. What we've seen is that this has created opportunities for lots of other people to do great things. So some shops have been able to, some of the smaller independent shops have been able to literally have a server count equivalent to what a AAA console team is operating with a top 10 title. And they've been able to make that decision in a week. That's a characteristic of fast growth that's in your control today. That's a byproduct of the dynamics of this market. One of the other things we always have to do is find somebody to play our games and get paid for them. I've done a lot of speaking in the video game business, and a lot of it has been in schools, which is some of the most fun. And let's see, any of you go to CMU? So maybe you've heard some of these before. Please forgive me if I use something over again. I often would go to classes that were mixed classes. They'd have designers and engineers and artists and producers and sound people all in one room at one time. And I would always come in, and the very first question I would ask was, what's the most important job in the video game business? And one by one member of every one of those guilds or crafts would get up and make a passionate defense. You know, the designer would get up, without a vision of where you're going, there is no game. The vision lies in my hands, and as a result, I'm the most important member of the team. Then the artist would get up and say, it's called video games. That means that what's on the video screen matters, so the art that I make must be the most important part of the game. The engineer gets up and laughs at everybody else in the room and says, all of that's nice, but nothing you do actually ends up on any screen unless I put it there. Then the sound guy gets up and says, but George Lucas says sound is 51% of the experience. So each one of them makes that passionate play, and it's funny because they get in these great arguments, and it's good. For me, it's teaching a class. It's like 20 minutes of the class is gone. It's instantly. It's wonderful. Then I turn to the first person in the front row that I've already picked out, and I say, give me $60. I've done this probably 30 times. Nobody's ever given me $60. What we have established now is the hardest thing in video games is getting paid. That continues to be the problem, but I believe it's more in your control than ever. Customers always have a clear idea of what they want today. They're less clear about what they want tomorrow, but their standards are high. What we have seen now is that people who design with their customer in mind, with their customer as a participant in the process, have revolutionized this. I would say that PUBG punk rocked the business big time. Figured out how to find users in a new way, figured out how to build their game on other people's technology, figured out how to build it using other people's assets, and figured out how to get to market as fast as possible. They also learned from what was working out in the market. So maybe PUBG isn't the Ramones, maybe it's the Sex Pistols, but it was a pretty good idea, and it was a pretty good fast follow. And what you, of course, saw immediately is the AAA showed up and used the same game plan. This is what happened in the music business, too. They all went off and signed punk rock bands. And the Talking Heads and U2 and lots of these other quote-unquote punk bands became the mainstream bands of the next 10 years. And then they spawned an entire generation of new punk rock bands. We'll talk about that in a moment. Obviously, Apex is the most recent player in this space where they refined many of the strategies that PUBG used, figured out how to have a more dynamic relationship with streamers, but also how to get into the marketplace in a broad fashion, in a very quick fashion. This is Tower Records in Sacramento, California. To me, this was one of the most important places when I grew up. The most important person who spun records in Las Vegas, Nevada was the person who worked the register at the Tower Records. I paid more attention to what they played in the record player than any DJ in town or any college radio station record host. That was the place that I went to go find my new records. The reason why is because Russell Solomon, who founded this, broke the cartel. Before that, Music Land and most of the other record stores that ran America at that time were rack jobbed by the major record manufacturers. Columbia or Epic, the majors would come in and they would decide what records were actually in that store. If you went to a clerk and asked them if they had a record in stock, chances are they didn't actually know because they weren't responsible for filling those racks. What Russell did was he bought from everybody. In particular, he bought imports early on when nobody else was doing that, but he also bought old records. He had a substantial used record market in this particular little place in Sacramento. And that grew into a worldwide institution that still survives in Japan today. It was very important to the video game business early on because they were one of the very first non-computer places to carry video games. And for somebody who'd grown up wanting to be in the music business, seeing my video game at Tower Records kind of meant I'd made it into the music business from my perspective. What was also important about Russell was that it meant if you were an independent record producer like Sire, that he would stock it. And so the first retailer to stock the Ramones in the US was Tower Records. I would make the case that Twitch has become that Tower Records of today. That it is the place where you can go and find that new game that you can't find anywhere else. and you can find it, you can see the whole thing. So the kids that live at my house, a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, they pretty much will not spend a nickel on a game until they probably watched it for 20 hours being played by somebody who's good on Twitch. It isn't just about what the streamers say, but it is about their discovery of the game and what's in it. I can no longer write a back package copy that matters to that audience. They got to see it, they have to almost experience to understand it, and combined with free to play, there's no place to hide anymore. Your game's great or it's not. Kind of like in punk rock. Your song was great or it wasn't. There was nothing else to hide that anymore. So from my perspective, Twitch has become a tool for the independents to find an audience, but it's also become an arbiter of true greatness and fairness in games, and I think we should celebrate that. Obviously, it's made some new kingmakers. These are the new DJs. They help make taste. Many of you know who these guys are. There are going to be new ones in the future, and they're going to evolve off into other medium. I think this is going to be a very interesting next couple of years as gaming really goes mainstream, as these guys bleed into the rest of the culture. So that takes us back to the Ramones. It was 4 guys from Flatbush who really wanted to play rock and roll, wanted to be The Who, wanted to be Led Zeppelin, wanted to be a mainstream rock and roller, but they didn't feel like they had an opportunity to do that. So they did what they could do. They played the songs they could play. They wrote the songs they could write. They played at CBGB's, the place that would let them play. They made records with Sire Records at Plaza Sound, which was available to them. And then our friend Russell Solomon figured out how to sell their stuff. And what that did was it fostered an entire generation of renewal for the music business, bringing on lots of other bands. But it also ended up bringing an entire next generation, and then a next generation, and then a next generation of punk rock, which has gone to renew the music business time after time. In my opinion, this is the first of a wave that's rebuilding the video game business in the same way that punk rock has rebuilt the music business multiple times. A band like U2 can fast follow the Sex Pistols and then become as mainstream as any band in America. Nirvana can re-pick up that handle and turn it into yet another form called grunge. Green Day re-owns it and then end up on Broadway, for God's sakes. Foo Fighters, obviously the evolution of what Nirvana used to be, but my 16-year-old lives for Panic! In the Disco, a punk rock band from Las Vegas, Nevada. For me personally, that is the close of the cycle. So for me, what I see in front of us is that same thing's going to happen in our business, which is if you have a great song, if you have a great game, it's the best time to find an audience. You have the best tools and the best access you've ever had in the history of the business. I would hope that you get the most out of that time. And maybe you can be like, I think that's Tommy, by the way, Ramon, but hopefully you can be like Tommy someday and be a big record producer as a result and have your own XM radio station. So give streamers what they want. Give players a great chance to love your game. Give them the chance to share that by becoming streamers of their own. Expand your vision of where we can go by using the tools of the AAA to make new visions of what's possible today. And then finally, return the games to the players. Let them help you make those games great. That's one of the great things that's coming out of Twitch, is a very discreet dialogue between game makers and game players that's making games better every day. Thank you.